morning. Time to talk about relative clauses. Now, before we start talking about the clauses themselves, we need to know what relative pronouns are. So, let's take a look. Here are the relative pronouns: which, where, who, when, whose, whom, that. These are the most common ones. Which is used when we're talking about a thing. Where, a place. Who is a person, but it is the subject pronoun. So we use it instead of he or she. When, of course, is time. Whose belongs to someone, the possession. Whom is the object pronoun of a person. So we use it instead of him or her. And that is one that we can use instead of who or which, but only in some cases. We'll talk about that a little later in this video. So, we have two types of relative clauses. Let's look at non-defining relative clauses first. These are used to give extra information. The clause, the non-defining relative clause, is surrounded by two commas, so a comma before it and a comma after it, or a comma before it and a full stop at the end. The sentence makes perfect sense without the relative clause, so we can take it out and it's still very clear what we're talking about. In a non-defining relative clause, we can't use that instead of who or which. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. So first of all, my sister, who is a doctor, lives in London. The fact that she is a doctor is extra information. Who is a doctor is the non-defining relative clause, and it's got commas around it. So a comma before who and a comma after doctor. The sentence makes perfect sense without it. My sister lives in London. It's a fact, yeah? We can't use that here. So we can't say my sister, that is a doctor, lives in London, right? That doesn't make sense. So my sister, who is a doctor, lives in London. Another example. I often go to Edinburgh, which is the capital of Scotland. Which is the capital of Scotland is the non-defining relative clause. That is the extra information. Okay. In this example, the non-defining relative clause has a comma before it and a full stop after it. The sentence makes perfect sense without it. I often go to Edinburgh. Fact. Okay. Again, we can't use that instead of which. So we can't say, I often go to Edinburgh, that is the capital of Scotland. All right. If you think of it like this, if there's a comma before the relative pronoun, we can't replace the relative pronoun with that. Okay, that does not come after a comma. Let's have a look at defining relative clauses now. These tell us which person, place, or thing we're referring to. We don't use any commas, and the sentence does not make any sense without it. So we must have the relative clause in the sentence. And here we can use that instead of who or which. Let's look at some examples. The woman who just got off the bus lives across the road from me. If we take out the relative clause, who just got off the bus, we would have the woman lives across the road from me. But which woman? There are lots of women. How do we know which one? We need the relative clause in the sentence. So we don't separate it with any commas. Okay, and the sentence doesn't make sense without it because we don't know which woman. We can use that instead of who or which. So here we can say, the woman that just got off the bus lives across the road from me. Let's have a look at another example. Where are the eggs which were in the fridge? So which were in the fridge is the defining relative clause, and it tells us which eggs we are talking about. So not the ones in the cupboard, not the ones in the shopping bag, but the ones in the fridge, those specific ones. Okay? If we just say, where are the eggs, it could mean any eggs in general. And especially if we've got lots of eggs in the house, or in the restaurant kitchen, for example, it's not clear which ones we're referring to if we don't have the defining relative clause. Again, we can use that instead of which. So we can say, where are the eggs that were in the fridge? Now, if we consider both sentences, both types of clauses together, the defining or the non-defining relative clause, these two sentences are almost identical. The only difference is the comma. So in the first sentence, we've got a comma after window before which, but in the second sentence, there are no commas. The first sentence is a non-defining relative clause. The relative clause, which was open, is extra information. The thief got into the house through the window. So that means there's only one window in the house. Whereas the second one, the thief got into the house through the window which was open, that is defining which window. So in this case, there are lots of windows in the house, but only one of them is open. Okay, lots of windows in the house, one is open, and that is the one that the thief entered the house from. Let's take a look at another example. My brother, who lives in London, is a lawyer. My brother who lives in London is a lawyer. Did you hear the difference in the way I said those two sentences? Listen again. My brother who lives in London is a lawyer. My brother who lives in London is a lawyer. You can hear the pauses, you can hear the commas in the first sentence. Okay, that is the non-defining relative clause. Who lives in London in that first sentence is extra information. Okay, so in this case, I have one brother, he lives in London, and he is a lawyer. Okay, whereas in the second case, my brother who lives in London is a lawyer. I have more than one brother, but the one that lives in London is a lawyer. The one that lives in, say, Birmingham is not. Okay. Let's take a look at one more set of examples. I saw a woman. The woman who I saw at the bank seemed very friendly. The woman who I saw at the bank seemed very friendly. Now, in this first case, we've got an extra little sentence. I saw a woman. So here, because we've already mentioned the woman, we know which one. We know which woman. So the fact that we saw her at the bank is just extra information. Whereas in the second example, the woman who I saw at the bank seemed very friendly. Here we need to define which woman because we haven't mentioned her before. Okay. We can leave out the relative pronoun in some cases. So we can we can omit who, which, or that. Only those three, if the subjects of the two clauses are different. We can't leave out the relative pronoun in a non-defining relative clause. So it has to be only in a defining relative clause. Let's look at some examples. She is the person that I met at the party, or she is the person who I met at the party, or she is the person I met at the party. So in the first clause, she is the person, she is the subject of the first clause, and in the second clause, I am the subject. I met her at the party. I am the subject of that one. So we've got two different subjects, okay? So we can leave it out. But in this case, she is the person who gave me a present. She is the person, she is the subject. She gave me a present. She is the subject of the second clause. Because the subject is the same, we cannot leave it out. We must have who in the sentence. Okay. Now, a couple of last things to remember. Relative pronouns are used in place of a subject or an object, just like normal pronouns are. So we don't repeat the subject or the object. Okay. For example, I often go cycling, which I really like it. That doesn't seem right, does it? So it is referring to cycling, which is also referring to cycling. So we can't have both, okay? It's too much repetition and it doesn't make sense. So we get rid of it. I often go cycling, which I really like. Okay. Well, I hope that helped you. Thank you very much for watching.